3 knocks, slow, then silence, inside the cabin. Elias Booker hadn't moved in 2 winters, until now. Then the story returns to the quiet of the storm. The fire had burned low in the stone hearth, but Elias Booker wasn't yet ready to stir it. He sat in the old rocking chair built by his father, its legs creaking faintly against the warped pine floor, his boots planted square, his body still. In his lap rested a block of softwood, untouched but not forgotten. The whittling knife in his hand moved slowly, not yet carving, only testing. He was not in a hurry. He hadn't been in a hurry for some years now. From the window, all he could see was white. Thick snow had swept in from the western ridge, swallowing the trail and erasing every hoofprint that had once led to his porch. The world was quiet, but not safe. Not out here. Not anymore. Not silent. Never quite silent out here, but hushed, as if the land had learned to breathe softer in his presence. A draft curled beneath the door, carrying with it the ghost of the past. He could smell its smoke, horses, pine bark, the faintest perfume of his late wife's lemon balm salve. Sometimes it caught him off guard and made his chest ache like a broken rib. His eyes drifted to the player piano in the corner. It was a fine piece once, cherrywood keys, scrolls of music curled inside like sleeping snakes. He hadn't touched it since Abigail passed, not once. Once or twice he'd considered playing it again, but his hand never made it past the first key. That was her sound, not his. He turned his focus back to the knife and the wood, letting the edge drag across the grain without digging. Time moved different out here. It didn't tick. It settled, like snow on branches. When the knock came, it was not loud. It wasn't the sound of a wind-blown shutter or a rabbit testing the porch steps. It was deliberate 3 knocks, slow. Then a pause, then one more. Elias froze, his eyes narrowing slightly. No one came this way in snow like this, not when the road was buried deep enough to swallow a wagon, and not unless they were lost or desperate. He laid the knife on the table and rose, each movement slow, as if reminding his joints they still had purpose. The cabin was quiet, save for the fire's soft hiss at the door. He reached up to unbolt the iron latch and opened it just enough to let in the cold. She stood there, framed in snow and wind, wrapped in a coat that didn't belong to her. It hung awkwardly, shoulders too wide, sleeves cuffed and wet. Her cheeks were raw with windburn, her lips cracked, and behind her, huddled beneath a threadbare quilt, were 3 children no taller than the gate fence. Elias didn't speak, and neither did she, but her eyes met his gray, wide, uncertain, and yet still burning with something she refused to let die. He stepped aside. She nodded, guiding the children into the warmth. The youngest, a girl with damp curls and a rag doll clutched tight to her chest, stumbled once, but didn't cry. The boys, a little older, moved like shadows, silent and stiff. The woman murmured something to them, but it was lost in the rustle of the quilt. Elias closed the door behind them and bolted it once more. They stood close to the fire, dripping quietly, unsure whether they belonged. He fetched another log and fed the flames, watching as light bloomed across the room, painting orange across pale cheeks. Still, none of them spoke. At last, she broke the silence, her voice hoarse. "We walked 3 days. The wagon broke east of Devil's Notch. Her hands, he noticed, were trembling from more than cold." He nodded, not as agreement, but acknowledgement. "I'm Mara," She added, "These are mine, Callan, Ezra, and Junia." The boys gave shy nods. The girl only blinked, gripping the doll tighter. You Lost his voice was rough from disuse. Not cruel, just dry, like a wind that hadn't carried words in a while. She shook her head once, left. That word carried more weight than most sermons. Elias didn't ask anything more. "Sit, dry off," he said after a pause. "I'll fetch something warm." He moved to the kitchen without hurry, pulling down the tin pot and scooping up what broth remained from the night before. It was thin bones, onion, and a curl of bay leaf, but it was hot, and hot was something. He returned with bowls and handed them out. The children didn't wait for permission. They ate fast, like it might be taken. Mara, by contrast, held her bowl without lifting it, eyes on her children. "You should eat," Elias said. "I will," she replied, but didn't move. He studied her not with suspicion, but with the sort of attention one gave to a thing that had clearly been broken and mended too many times. The fire crackled gently. The children, full now, curled on the rug in a loose pile. Elias stood and crossed the room, pulling a folded quilt from the cedar chest. He draped it over them slowly, gently, as if afraid to wake whatever fragile thing sleep had offered them. "You alone here?" Mara asked, her voice softer now. He gave a slight nod. "Been that way 2 winters." Her eyes shifted, not pitying, just knowing. "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "Storms come. Sometimes they don't leave." Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The fire filled the space between them. "I tried to get to Helena," she said at last. "Had a cousin out there. Thought she'd help. My husband. He turned back when the food ran low. Said I'd made my bed." Elias looked at her. "He left you. In winter. With children." A nod. No tears. No tremble. Just a fact. Told the way hard things are when they've been told before. He poured another cup of coffee and slid it across the table. She took it in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her skin. "You can stay," he said. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes were on the fire, watching the logs collapse into coals. "Thank you," she whispered at last. "No need," he answered. "Not yet." He returned to his chair and picked up the half-carved block of wood. It had no shape yet. Maybe it would stay that way. Maybe not. Silence came again, but not the kind that hurt. This one breathed easier, as if recognizing it wasn't alone. Elias noticed the way the children's breathing found rhythm, how Mara wrapped her coat tighter, not to keep him out, but to steady herself. The fire popped once, loud in the quiet. Outside, the wind howled and flung snow like fists, but inside, the storm lost its hold. A man, a woman, and 3 children shared breath under the same roof. Elias didn't believe in miracles anymore, but he did believe in open doors, and sometimes that was enough. Elias stirred the fire once more, but for the first time in 2 years. He didn't sit back down. He listened because there were more lives breathing beneath his roof than his own. But in that hush, something lingered too still, like the woods were holding their breath. A pale hush had fallen over the land, and the light that crept through the cracks in the wooden shutters was thin, but untroubled. It was morning. Though time here passed with the sort of slow patience found only in places where nothing rushed, the snow outside had crusted over during the night, forming a shell of quiet around the cabin. And within that stillness, the world felt held, cradled. Even inside. The fire had burned down to a low amber glow. Elias Booker was already moving. his boots soft on the old plank floor. The heavy wool blanket he'd slept under folded neatly across the foot of the bed. He moved like someone used to the quiet, a man who had learned not to wake ghosts by walking too loud. At the table, he ladled water from a dented pail into the pot atop the stove and stirred the oats that had soaked overnight. As steam began to rise, so did the familiar smells of salt, wood, and faint cinnamon left over from a jar that Abigail had once hidden in the back of the cabinet. He hadn't used it in years, but this morning, as the weight of shared breath settled into the cabin's walls, he'd added a pinch without thinking. He glanced toward the hearth. The children were a heap of limbs beneath the quilt, still deep in the kind of sleep that only comes when hunger has finally been sated and the cold has, for the first time in weeks, been chased from the bones. The girl Junia held her rag doll beneath her chin, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was almost musical. Callan and Ezra slept tangled together, their legs like saplings that had grown too close. Behind them, against the far wall near the kitchen shelves, Mara Linley stirred. She sat up slowly, shoulders stiff from sleeping on the floor, her coat bunched beneath her head as a makeshift pillow. She didn't speak. She looked first to her children, then to Elias, as if checking to see if morning had changed anything. "You slept," Elias said without turning from the stove. "I tried," she answered. She stood, pulled her coat tighter, and crossed the room to crouch beside the children, checking for fever, breath, restlessness. When she was satisfied, she came to the table where he poured oats into 2 bowls and offered her one. "Thank you," she said, sitting by the window. Elias watched her hold the bowl in both hands, soaking the warmth into her fingers. She didn't eat right away. Instead, she stared out the frosted pane, where the first blue of morning was lifting above the ridge. The sky was pale and sharp, like it might break if touched too hard. "Storm's past," Elias said, "but the trail's gone." "I'm not trying to find it," she replied. She didn't look at him, and he didn't ask her to. Behind them, the quilt shifted. Ezra blinked first, rubbing his eyes with slow fingers, then Callan, stretching like a colt learning its legs. Junia stirred last, her face tucked beneath the edge of the blanket. She blinked once at Elias, then closed her eyes again, curling deeper into the wool. "Come on," Mara said gently. "Wash up." There was no protest. The boys rose, yawning, and followed her to the basin Elias had left near the door. The bucket beside it still held meltwater, and though it was cold, none of them complained. They had learned not to. Elias leaned against the kitchen beam, watching the way Callan glanced at the shelves above the mantel, his eyes snagging on something Elias had almost forgotten. A wooden horse, carved long ago, simple, plain, but solid. Elias had made it the winter after Abigail's death and had never found the will to give it to anyone. It had sat there, gathering dust, waiting. "You make this?" Callan asked, holding it up with care. Elias nodded. "Long time back." The boy turned it over in his hands, inspecting every curve and notch as though it were gold. "It's good," he said. "Can I show Junia?" Elias opened his mouth to answer, but the wind shifted, not loud, not strong, just wrong, like something outside remembered its way back. "You can keep it." Callan looked up, surprised, but didn't argue. He turned to his sister and held it out. Junia took it without a word, hugging it to her chest beside her doll. After breakfast, the children moved toward the hearth again, sitting cross-legged as Mara began gathering the bowls. She moved quietly, rinsing dishes at the back sink without needing to be asked. Her steps were practiced, light, but there was something in them, a need not to owe too much. "You didn't have to," Elias said as he watched her sweep the crumbs from the table. "I know," she replied, tying off the dish rag. "But it helped me feel like I belonged, at least for a minute." She glanced toward the fire, where Junia was humming softly under her breath, rocking the wooden horse gently in her lap. The sound was high and sweet, not quite melody, not quite words. Elias caught it in his chest, something small and forgotten. Not joy, not yet, but the shape of it. "I used to sweep when I had nowhere to go," Mara said after a moment. "Back when we first got to Deer Creek. Jedediah used to leave before dawn and come back after dark. Wouldn't speak to me most days. I'd clean to keep myself sane." Elias didn't answer. He returned to his chair, where the unfinished carving still waited. He picked it up, turned it once in his hand, and began shaving a long curl from its edge. "I wasn't always this quiet," he said, surprising himself. "Used to talk too much, if you can believe it. Abigail said I never knew when to leave well enough alone." "What changed?" Mara asked. He looked at the carving but didn't answer. "Not right away." "She died," he said simply. And the silence came in like snow, thick, slow, stayed. The cabin went still again, but not cold. The day moved forward in small ways. Elias chopped more wood. Mara boiled water for socks and shirts that needed washing. Ezra tried drawing the horse with a bit of charcoal on old scrap paper. Callan watched Elias split logs, asking questions about the axe, the wood, the wind. Elias answered them all with calm precision. Later, while Mara stood stirring stew with one hand and keeping Junia close with the other, Elias caught a sound light, careful steps outside. He moved to the window and saw Callan stacking kindling, mimicking the way Elias had done it earlier. The boy's shoulders were square, his eyes focused. It was a small thing, but it felt like something being passed on. By evening, the stew filled the cabin with the scent of thyme and boiled carrot. Elias set the table without asking, and Mara ladled servings with a measured hand. The children sat around the flame, legs tucked beneath them, waiting for warmth. After they ate, Mara sat down with a needle and thread, mending one of Elias's old shirts without being asked. "You're good with them," Elias said, watching the way her hands worked. "They make it easy," she replied. "They talk about you all day," he added. "Callan says you know the names of every tree." She smiled, not at him, but at the thread she was tying off. "He exaggerates. Still, he believes it." She looked up, and something passed between them, not longing. Not yet, but something quieter. An understanding that people didn't always get to choose who depended on them. "They're healing," Elias said, "faster than I expected." "They're children," she said. "They know how to trust again." Her voice caught on the word again, but she didn't let it show. Elias reached for another piece of wood, but paused when Junia came near. She held the wooden horse in one hand, the doll in the other. She sat beside him, wordless, and looked at the carving he held. "Is it for me?" she asked quietly. "If you want it." She nodded, solemn. "It's pretty," she said. "And then Mama says we changed, says we were scared worms, and now we're family." Elias smiled, not wide, but true. "That sounds about right." The wind outside had softened, and the sky had taken on that faint pinkish hue that meant spring was inching closer, even if it hadn't yet arrived. Inside the cabin, the hearth glowed strong. She tucked a loose lock behind her ear, not realizing Elias was watching. You alone here? She asked. And he answered, Not anymore. By noon, the creek whispered beneath the ice. By dusk, fresh footprints marked the edge of Elias's land. The warmth that had crept into the cabin over the past 2 days now reached beyond its walls. It lingered in the steam rising from the stew pot and in the soft hum of Junia as she braided the yarn hair of her doll. It pressed through the seams of the cabin like smoke, wrapping around each person within as if trying to stitch them together. Still, out beyond the trees, the world was not yet done testing them. That morning, Mara found herself outside just past sunup. The snow had begun to pull back from the earth, leaving muddy patches where grass might dare to grow again. She knelt beside the plot near the well, a bare square of land where someone had once tried to start a garden. Her fingers brushed the thawing dirt, remembering the way her mother used to teach her to test the ground for life. Inside, Elias worked at the table, smoothing the edges of a new carving. This one had begun to take form a fawn, legs delicate and unsure. Callan sat beside him, watching each movement with that same quiet hunger. He didn't interrupt, just listened as the blade whispered over wood grain. Ezra, meanwhile, had taken to sketching in charcoal again, drawing crooked shapes that resembled trees and the outlines of animals. Elias glanced over once, noticing a shape in the corner of the page. It was the cabin, drawn with a kind of reverence. The smoke curled from the chimney like a signature. Junia slept on the rug beside the hearth. Her wooden horse and the ragged doll curled against her chest like siblings. Later, while preparing the midday meal, Mara caught Elias watching the children. She said nothing at first, just poured hot water over the cornmeal and stirred slow. "You look like someone waiting to be needed again," she said at last. Elias's eyes lingered on the children. "Maybe I am," before Mara could answer. A strange unease shifted the room. It was something in the air, not sound, not smell, but something known to those who'd lived through trouble. A weight that pressed at the windows. Elias stood, his body gone still in the way animals do before lightning strikes. He crossed to the door and opened it just enough to look out over the rise. There, in the distance, cutting slow through the snowmelt, were fresh hoofprints. A single rider, dark against the thawed edge of the trail, was making his way toward the cabin. Elias's shoulders shifted slightly, not tensed but braced. Mara stepped up beside him, her breath catching before her mind understood. When she saw the man dismount near the fence line, the bowl she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and cracked against the cabin floor. She didn't move to pick it up. The man walked with the confidence of someone who thought ownership was permanent. His boots were clean, his coat new, his hat cocked just so. And yet, something behind his eyes had soured the kind of smile that knew how to cut. "Well now," he said as he reached the porch, tipping his hat in mock courtesy. "Ain't this sweet?" Elias stepped forward, not fast, but without pause. He stood square in front of the children who'd appeared behind the curtain, peering through the slats. Mara's voice didn't shake when she spoke. "Jedediah." He looked at her, as if trying to decide whether he was pleased or irritated by the sound of his own name. "Been a long ride," he said, as though they were neighbors catching up over fence posts. "Heard you were out here. Took some digging. But I found the right whisper." Elias's eyes didn't waver. "You're not welcome here." Jedediah looked him up and down, the corners of his mouth twitching. "I believe I still have a say. They're mine." "Aren't they?" Mara stepped out then, placing herself beside Elias. Her eyes were hard. "You left us, in the snow, when Unia was sick and we had no fire. Jedediah held up a hand. All false grace. Made a mistake. What man hasn't? But I'm here now. That counts for something. No, Elias said, voice low and even. It doesn't. Jedediah's smile thinned. By law, I'm still their father, which means I got claim, whether you like it or not. You had your chance, Mara said. You spent it. He shifted his stance, placing one foot on the porch step, testing how far he could press. I'll be back tomorrow, he said, with papers. You can stay if you want, but they come with me. At that, Junia emerged, unnoticed until she spoke. She stood on the threshold, her doll clutched to her chest, and said nothing at first. Her eyes found her mother, then Elias. Then they moved to Jedediah. Her small voice carried more steel than anyone expected. He scares Mama. Jedediah looked as though slapped. Elias didn't move, but the space around him shifted, solidified, like earth drying after storm. You should go, he said. Jedediah turned without another word and mounted his horse. His face held no rage, only calculation. He tipped his hat again, mockingly. You've had your little fairy tale, he called over his shoulder. Time to wake up. The sound of hooves faded into the thinning snow, but his words lingered like the scent of a burned field. Inside, the silence was thick. The children stood near the hearth, not asking questions. They didn't have to. They knew what danger looked like, and they knew it wasn't always loud. Mara moved around the kitchen, folding towels that didn't need folding, her hands moving too fast, too tightly. Elias sat at the table, sharpening his knife not because it was dull, but because the rhythm steadied him. He can't take them, Mara said finally, barely above a whisper. But he'll try, and he'll bring papers. Or worse. Elias nodded slowly. We can fight it, but it won't be easy. I won't marry again, she said suddenly. Not to protect them. I won't trade one prison for another. Elias looked up, calm. You wouldn't be? Her eyes met his, fierce beneath the film of fear. Even if you're kind, even if I trust you, that's still not freedom. I'm not offering marriage, he said. I'm offering to stand in front of him, with you, if need be. She sat across from him, fingers twisted in her lap. I thought we were safe, she said, just for a while. You are, Elias said. You are. But shadows don't knock. They let themselves in. He rose, crossed the room, and laid a fresh log on the fire. Then he pulled something from beneath the table, an unfinished piece of wood, heavier than the others, pale as bone. He placed it near the carving tools, not yet touching it. The children had fallen asleep, curled again in their quilt, dreams clinging close. Elias stared at the block of ash wood in his hands. It wasn't anything yet, but he could see the lines. He could feel the shape it wanted to be. A cradle. He hadn't intended it. Not really. But some things come out of the hands before the heart's ready to admit why. He laid a fresh log on the fire and picked up the carving knife. The piece of wood in his hand wasn't meant to be anything, but his hands moved with memory, and this time, they began to shape a cradle. By mid-morning, the road no longer slept. Dust rose in two thin trails, hooves and law, heading straight for the cabin. Elias Booker was splitting kindling when he felt it. Not heard felt. A shift in the low wind, a faint tremble along the ground, like the land bracing itself. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on the leg of his trousers, and looked east down the bend where the old road, now nearly forgotten, dipped behind the butte. A cloud of dust rose against the morning light. Two riders, not rushing, but with purpose. One sat straight-backed, stiff in the saddle. The other leaned forward slightly, as if guiding trouble by the reins. Elias turned toward the cabin and saw Mara standing on the porch, her hands damp with flour from kneading bread, her face pale in the gold light. She knew. She didn't need the dust to tell her. Inside. The children were quiet, though the change in the air had settled heavy in their bones. Junia clung to her doll, not crying, just holding. Ezra stopped mid-sketch, and Callan pressed his hand against the window glass, squinting out toward the trail like he might recognize the shape of justice or betrayal riding toward them. Mara stepped down from the porch, slow and careful. Elias met her at the bottom of the steps. "Two of them," he said. "One wears law." She nodded, voice flat. "Jedediah doesn't come empty-handed." They didn't speak again. There was nothing more to say. The riders approached at a steady clip. The first wore a pressed brown coat with brass buttons and a badge too polished for a town like theirs. The second was Jedediah Linley, smug as ever, his hat tilted just enough to look casual, his coat newer than last week's, his boots shining. They dismounted without ceremony. "Ma'am," said the lawman, tipping his hat. "Sheriff Tillman, appointed through Ash Fork Circuit, traveling with court orders." Elias noticed the man avoided looking anyone in the eye for more than a second. "This here's a signed petition," Sheriff Tillman continued, reaching into a satchel and pulling free a folded paper. "Temporary custody transfer, pending further review in Prescott or Helena, issued by Judge Mulgrew 3 days past." Mara didn't move. Her voice, when it came, was iron through silk. "He abandoned us." Sheriff Tillman hesitated. "That's not part of the document." "He left his daughter sick," Mara said. "He left us without fire. He drank every dollar into dust and took the wagon." Jedediah stepped forward, hands raised like some cheap parlor preacher. "I made mistakes, sure, but I came back." "Didn't I? What matters is I'm here now. I'm their blood." "Blood don't make you fit," Elias said quietly. Sheriff Tillman opened the paper, cleared his throat. "I'm not here to argue sentiment. Law says the children go with their father, while the claim's sorted." "They're not going," Mara said, each word drawn like a blade. The door creaked open behind them. Miss Calhoun's voice came first. "That man's no father." She stood near the fence line, skirt damp with snowmelt, cheeks flushed from a fast walk. Behind her, Doc Everett's pulled up his wagon, his coat crooked, eyes sharp with something other than age. Reverend Bly followed on foot, leaning on his cane, but steady. "You can ask the doc how many times that woman's gone hungry so her children wouldn't." Miss Calhoun continued, "Ask me how many times she's swept my floors just to earn a single bar of soap." Sheriff Tillman turned, uncertain now. Doc Everett stepped forward, nodding toward Mara. "She came out of the storm with a child near death, and 2 more too thin for their age. Built them back from nothing. That man," he nodded at Jedediah, "rode out the same week with a jug and a saddle. And no one's seen him sober since." More figures appeared along the trail. Ben Miller, the stable hand, May Darnell, old widow from the bluff, one by one. They gathered not to shout, not to threaten, but to stand. Sheriff Tillman cleared his throat again. "This is all very fine, but I can't waste stories. I got to follow the ruling." Elias stepped forward. "There's a clause," he said. "Homestead Sanctuary Law, Territorial Code, page 47. If a community objects and declares witness, the custody can be delayed by appeal." Sheriff Tillman blinked. "That's so. Been on the books since 1879, Elias said. I'll file the motion myself in Helena, but you don't get to take them today." Jedediah sneered. "You really think some backwoods code's gonna hold up?" Sheriff Tillman looked at the crowd, then at the paper in his hands, then at Mara. "I'll not be dragging children away when half the town says it's wrong," he said. "Take it to court. Until then, they stay." Jedediah's mouth tightened. He looked like a man trying hard not to spit. "You think this is over?" he hissed. Elias didn't answer. He didn't have to. Jedediah mounted his horse and turned without another word. The sheriff followed. Slower. Glancing back at the group once before, they disappeared over the ridge. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't move much. They just stood there. A quiet wall of presence. Mara's hands were shaking now, though she kept them hidden in her apron folds. "Thank you." She whispered to no one in particular. Her voice cracked, and she closed her eyes. Elias watched her, his jaw tight. That night, the fire burned hot, but Elias didn't sleep. Outside, something moved in the trees, or maybe it was just the wind refusing to forget. The children slept close together beneath their quilt, the wooden horse tucked between Ezra and Junia like a sentinel. Mara sat beside the hearth, arms wrapped around herself, staring into the flames. "He'll be back," she said. Elias nodded. "Then we'll be stronger still." Her gaze turned toward him, not like someone begging for rescue, but someone measuring the shape of hope against memory. Outside, snow melted into the dirt. Inside, the cradle waited unfinished in the corner. She tucked a loose lock behind her ear, not realizing Elias was watching. "You alone here?" she asked, and he answered, "Not anymore." The sheriff tipped his hat, backed his horse away, and muttered to Jedediah, "You want to fight? You'll have to take it to court. This town won't let it be easy." The first lilacs bloomed crooked near the barn. They didn't ask to belong. They just did. Mara Lindley stood at the edge of the patch of earth she and Elias had turned over together a week past. The soil was still reluctant, clinging to the cold in its depths, but signs of the thaw were visible now. Tiny green shoots pressed through where the lilac bush had struggled to return. It looked out of place in the high, wind-bitten plateau, like it belonged to another life entirely, but it had bloomed anyway. She watched it sway in the light morning breeze and felt something strange flutter in her chest. Not quite hope, not quite fear, just breath. Behind her, the cabin stirred. Ezra had already taken up the charcoal again, sprawled near the hearth with a scrap of feed sack paper he used like canvas. Callan was outside by the woodpile, stacking with Elias, talking as he worked. Junia had taken to trailing Mara most mornings, her doll tucked in the crook of her arm like a second limb. Inside, the cradle waited in the shadows near the fireplace. Elias hadn't mentioned it, and she hadn't asked, but every time she passed it, she noticed the way the edges were softening, the lines coming together with intention. She found herself resting her hand on its edge once, as if to steady herself. The wind shifted, warm today, dusty, carrying the scent of firewood and flour. She returned to the kitchen and began kneading dough with sleeves rolled past her elbows and her hair tied with a faded strip of cloth that used to belong to her mother. The children's laughter, faint but real, floated through the open door. Elias entered not long after, his coat smelling of cedar and old snow. He paused in the doorway, watching her press her palms into the dough. "Never figured you for bread making," he said. "I didn't either." She replied without looking up. "But I learned, the way women do when they're waiting for someone who doesn't come back." He crossed the room, moved to the pantry door, and began tightening the hinge that had sagged through winter. The two of them worked side by side, not speaking for a while. "He was gone long before I left," she said, her voice lower now. Elias set his screwdriver down and met her gaze. "He gone long before you admitted it." She nodded, wiped her hands on her apron. "He was the kind of man who loved you only when you needed nothing." "There's plenty like him," Elias said, not with bitterness, but weariness. She glanced at him, and something passed between them, quiet understanding forged not in pity, but in endurance. "You ever wish you'd left instead of stayed?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said, "but I'd have carried her absence either way, at least here. I know the weight of it." She pressed her knuckles into the dough. "Grief's strange. You think it'll hollow you out, but it fills you instead. Makes a room in you you never planned to furnish." Elias watched her fingers, now moving slower, more gently. "And when someone walks into it," she continued, "you're not sure if you should ask them to stay." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Later that day, Ezra spiked a fever. He had been quiet at breakfast, but no more than usual. By late afternoon, he'd curled up by the hearth and refused food. When Junia touched his forehead and said, "Mama," he's warm. The world shifted again. Mara lifted him gently, laying him on the cot by the wall, brushing damp hair from his face. Her hands were sure, but Elias could see the worry behind her eyes, the tightness at the corners, the quickening breath. He didn't speak. He fetched willow bark from the shelf, boiled water, soaked cloths in snowmelt. Callan sat quietly, eyes wide. Junia didn't cry, just curled beside her brother and hummed soft lullabies made of sound more than words. "You can sleep," Elias told Mara sometime before dawn. "I won't," she replied. "Not until he's through it." "He will be." "How do you know?" He looked at her then. Truly looked. Her arms curled around the boy, her dress wrinkled from sitting too long, her eyes red with the refusal to rest. "Because you're still here," he said. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. Her hand brushed his when he passed her a fresh cloth. The touch lingered longer than it needed to. By the time the sun began to rise, pale and gold across the thawing field, Theo's fever had broken. He slept deep and quiet. His hand curled around the corner of his blanket like a lifeline. Mara didn't rise right away. She sat still, head bowed, whispering something that sounded like a prayer, though maybe it was only breath. Elias turned from the window and looked at the cradle, now nearly done. He'd sanded the edges smooth the night before. The butterfly carving Junia had left beside it caught the morning light. Outside, the town waited. The courthouse in Helena was 2 days' ride away. Elias had already packed what he needed: documents, a fresh shirt, letters from Doc Everett's and Miss Calhoun. The delay granted by Sheriff Tillman wouldn't last long. He'd ride soon. Mara rose, her eyes soft with exhaustion but steadier now. "You didn't have to sit up," she said. "I wanted to." She nodded, and for the first time, leaned into him, not fully, not completely, but enough. They stood like that for a moment. Callan burst in from outside not long after, face flushed, holding a folded paper in one hand. "Miss Calhoun sent word," he said. "Says she found the name of the judge. Says he's fair." Elias took the paper and glanced at the note ink smudged, written in hurried but clear script. "Judge Halbrook, Circuit Court." "We'll ride tomorrow," he said. Mara looked down at Theo, who was still breathing slow and steady. She nodded again, then reached into her apron and pulled out something small. "I've carried this since the night you gave it to me," she said. "It was the wooden ring. Not because I had to, Because I wanted to remember what it felt like, to be offered something without conditions. Elias looked at her, heart caught somewhere behind the ribs. You don't owe me anything. I know, she said. But I'd like to offer you something, too. She didn't speak more. She didn't need to. That night, as the fire burned low and the children finally rested without cough or fever, Elias placed the finished cradle near the hearth. He didn't speak as he did it. He didn't need to. The butterfly rested beside it. She doesn't speak. She simply slips the ring into her apron and stands beside him as the children sleep. Tomorrow. They ride to Helena. They rode out before first light. Behind them, the cabin held its breath. The trail to Helena was still patched with snow and streaked in places where spring had broken through, revealing the mud-colored spine of the road beneath. The sky was glass pale and brittle with chill, but no wind moved. The only sound was hooves against thawed dirt and the creak of saddle leather beneath layered coats. Elias rode ahead, posture straight, eyes set toward the ridge. He'd taken his old army satchel, the one with worn straps and a rusted clasp, and tucked the legal papers inside, alongside a folded letter from Reverend Bly and another from Doc Everett's. They'd offered them without prompting, without plea. He had not asked, only received. Mara rode behind, the children in a borrowed wagon guided by Ben Miller, who tipped his hat at every mile like it might carry a prayer. Junia sat bundled between her brothers, her doll clasped to her side and the butterfly carving tucked into her coat pocket. Ezra watched the trees pass as if memorizing them, as if he might one day draw every branch by memory. Callan leaned forward, whispering to the horses. They made camp the first night just past Red Hollow, where a circle of blackened stones marked an old stopping place. Elias built the fire while Mara laid out the quilts. Neither said much. The children fell asleep quickly. After they slept, Elias handed Mara a tin cup of warm cider and nodded toward the stars. You ever been to court? He asked. Once. Years ago. I watched a friend get ruled against for something her husband did. He waited. She cried without sound. Mara said, the kind that doesn't ask to be comforted. This won't be that, Elias said. We've got more than silence. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. By the second day, the road grew clearer, the pines thinned, and the distant outline of Helena appeared as a gray smudge against the horizon. The courthouse sat on the edge of the rising town, a simple brick building with tall windows and whitewashed trim. It smelled of dust and ink, and the kind of wood polish reserved for places that wanted to look more official than they felt. Inside, the pews were mostly full. Miss Calhoun had arrived an hour before with Doc Everett's and Pastor Bly. May Darnell sat stiff-backed in her shawl. Even young Ben Miller stood near the back, hat in hand, boots still wet with trail mud. Jedediah was already there, dressed in a dark coat too fine for the truth, his mustache trimmed, his hair parted with careful oil. He looked like a man confident in his story. He barely glanced at Mara when she entered. Judge Halbrook sat tall at the bench, older, sharp-eyed, with hands that didn't shake when he turned the pages before him. The room went still. The clerk called the matter aloud. Petition for full and permanent custody of Callan Linley, Ezra Linley, and Junia Linley. Elias stood. We contest the petition. The judge looked at Mara. Are you prepared to testify? Yes, Your Honor. Her voice didn't tremble. Jedediah went first. He spoke smoothly, practiced. She ran, he said, took the children without my leave, left our land, disrespected my name. He said she was reckless, said she was unstable, said Elias was a drifter who'd taken advantage of a widow. When he finished, he folded his hands like a man waiting to be thanked. Mara stepped forward. She says nothing in her own defense, he added. I speak now, Mara said. She stood at the center of the courtroom, her hands relaxed at her sides, her dress plain but clean, her hair tied back. He left us, she said. There was no food, no fire, no hope. My daughter was sick. My sons were hungry. He left before the snow, and we followed a trail that nearly killed us, but it was better than staying behind. Judge Halbrook leaned forward slightly. Mara looked at the room, not the judge, not Jedediah, but at the people who had come. I did not run from him. I walked toward something better. I walked until I found someone who didn't ask for anything but honesty, and he gave more back than I could have imagined. She stepped back. The judge turned to Elias. Elias stood without rustling his coat, without clearing his throat. I was lost when they found me, he said. Not in the way men get lost in the woods, but in the kind that sticks to your bones. I had nothing left I thought worth giving, and then these children showed up with their mother, cold, starving, nearly broken. He paused, looking toward them, and they reminded me what it meant to be needed, what it meant to give again, and every day since, I've remembered what it means to build something, even when you think the ground's too dry. He stepped down. No grand gestures, just the truth, plain and steady. The judge turned the papers in front of him once more. The courtroom had gone still as the snowfall before a storm. After a long moment, Judge Halbrook spoke. I have considered the statements, the testimony, and the community presence. Custody is granted to Mara Linley, full and permanent. The petition for removal is denied. No right to appeal. Jedediah rose from his seat, mouth open. This isn't— You are dismissed, the judge said firmly. Leave the room. Jedediah hesitated, looked around, but no one met his eyes. He turned and left with no more than the sound of his boots. Outside, the sun had broken through the gray clouds, spreading light across the courthouse steps. The breeze carried the faint scent of lilacs and wood smoke. Mara stood with the children gathered around her, holding each one close, one by one. Then she turned to Elias. She reached into her pocket and pulled free the wooden ring. I've carried this since the night you gave it to me, she said. Not because I had to, because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be offered something without conditions. He met her eyes. You don't owe me anything, he said. I know, she replied, and took his hand. But I'd like to offer you something, too. She paused. I'd like to stay. Not just through the next storm, not just to raise these children, but because when I look at you, I don't see rescue. I see home. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He pulled her close, and she let him. That night, the cabin welcomed them back with the scent of pine and ash. The fire crackled low. The cradle stood by the hearth, rocking slightly with the stir of a late breeze through the open window. Junia slept curled beside it, the butterfly near her cheek. Colin and Ezra were already dozing against the far wall, boots muddy, faces calm. The wooden ring sat on the mantel beside the fox and the horse symbols of survival, belonging, and everything unspoken that still held weight. The final frost had passed, and if you stood just outside the cabin and listened, you would not hear thunder, nor wind, nor song, but something quieter still. The steady creak of a cradle. She reached into her coat, pulled out the wooden ring, and placed it in Elias's hand. I'd like to stay, not because I must, but because when I look at you, I see home. And so the snow has melted, and the lilacs bloom crooked but brave by the barn once more. And we're left now with only the hush of wind through grass and the weight of what lingers long after stories close their doors. Maybe you can still hear it if you listen close, the creak of an old cradle swaying with memory. The echo of a name spoken softly, not because it was needed, but because it was remembered. Elias Booker and Mara Linley may have passed back into the dust of Deadmere Crossing, back into the folds of time where stories are folded into silence, but the shape of them remains carved deep into the grain of that place. You see, not every hero rides in on a black horse, and not every villain is met with thunder. Sometimes, redemption rides quietly on a borrowed wagon. Sometimes it hums in a child's lullaby, or rests in the weight of a wooden ring passed hand to hand, worn smooth with the soft grind of hope. We don't need to retell the tale to feel its roots reaching down into soil turned by hands that shook, into timber warmed by voices that had long forgotten what laughter felt like. There was no gunfight, no showdown at noon, but there was a battle all the same, a battle for breath, for belonging, for the right to choose who you become after the storm. Some say justice is a flame that burns bright and fast, but here, in this story, it burned slow, like the last coal in the hearth, like the fading scent of lemon balm in a drawer never opened again. The law came, sharp as a blade dressed in paper and brass, but it left dull and worn, bested by truths too quiet to shout. And what of the children, Callan, who watched the world with a craftsman's eye, Ezra, who drew stories no one else could see, Junia, who named her fears and then walked right past them? They are not just names, they are seeds carried by the wind, proof that a generation can be saved not with might, but with mercy. There's something holy in a man who builds again, knowing what he lost. There's something sacred in a woman who stands, even when the world has made her bend. Honor can be buried, but not erased. Justice may come late, but it still matters. And love, the kind that's carved slowly, steadily. Without demand, it holds. It holds in the cracks of door frames, in bread shared after silence, in the steady gaze of someone who chooses to stay. So if you feel the ache of something unfinished, know that this story wasn't made to close clean. It was meant to echo like a letter left unsent, but still opened, like horse tracks left in thawing snow, like a wind that circles back at dusk just to see if the cabin light still glows. Maybe you're sitting now with the lamp burning low, shadows curling on your floor like old friends. Maybe you see something of yourself in them. Maybe you too have known what it is to be forgotten, or to forgive, or to wait, longer than you thought you could, for someone to knock on your door. And if that's so, maybe this story was for you. Maybe you've lived 100 winters in one breath and needed to remember that kindness doesn't die. It just goes quiet until someone calls it back. So if this tale sat in your chest like an old coin you thought was lost, don't rush to close the book. Sit with it. Breathe with it. Let the dust settle. And if you still believe in honor, the kind that doesn't shout, or in love that arrives late but true, or in the courage of a woman with no name in the papers, only strength in her hands, then leave a sign. Type 1 below. Just one like a match struck in darkness, like the first knock on a long-forgotten door. And if your heart is drawn to stories like this, join us again at Westwind Whispers. We tell them slow, under the quiet sky, the way they were meant to be told. Until then, may your fire never go out, and your home always hold more than just walls. The wind remembers, The earth forgives, and love, even when late, still counts.